Thanks everybody who wanted to hear about how to spend your first 10K, and also those of you who couldn't find track 2 and just stayed here anyway. So who is this guy? So I just wanted to give a little bit of background about myself. Some of you saw Sean Ellis before lunch. I was Sean's first hire at LogMeIn. Worked with Sean for several years, succeeded him actually when he left to do Dropbox and various other good stuff. I've also most recently spent 3 years running alternatively marketing / growth / performance marketing at SoFi, which is a fintech company doing pretty well. So happy to talk about that and answer questions about that. Right now I'm hanging out at Trinity Ventures. It's a great venture fund, and I'm very interested in this question of growth teams and how do you build growth teams if you're a Series A, B, or C company alongside existing traditional marketing, product, and engineering teams. And I've been talking with a lot of founder CEOs about this exact issue and how do you set it up so that people aren't stepping on each other's toes. I think that that's a really critical challenge because every tech company should have a cross-functional growth team. At the bottom are some companies I've worked with, and I've spent a little bit of time on the dark side investing. So that is something I kind of understand, but I'm definitely more of a growth person myself. So I have a very short presentation. I'm going to go through 7 heuristics or thoughts when you think about launching a marketing program. They vary in terms of complexity and difficulty. Some of them will be really obvious. The key is just to try to take away 1 or 2 gems and take it back to your business and be like, oh yeah, that was a really good idea. I didn't think of that. So if you walk away from this talk with that, then I'm feeling pretty good. So without further ado, I'd love to talk about investing in what I call zero-cost channels. Before you spend your first dime, there's a lot of marketing things that you can do to drive acquisition. And I'm focused on acquisition here, just to level set. A lot of growth folks come from more of a product background. Growth, of course, sits at the intersection of product and marketing. But I'm going to be focused a lot on acquisition, how you use dollars to drive acquisition, because I have a marketing background, and I think that that's something that a lot of product people and more senior people haven't necessarily thought about in terms of scaling their business. And so zero-cost channels are good because they don't cost any money, but they have a hidden cost, which is the time you put into them. So when you're really small and you're trying to figure out what to do, you may invest in zero-cost channels to get long-tail returns. Search engine optimization is a great example. It's been around for 15 years. You could argue that for certain types of industries, it's not going to work very well. It's not very sexy. But the truth of the matter is, if you invest time in having a really readable site that your customers like, Google will pick that up. And if you get credible backlinks, one of the companies I helped built a glossary of search terms. And this was in the last 12 months, so this is not old. They built a glossary of search terms relative to complex financial terms around mortgage, and they were actually able to get on the first 3 pages for a number of these long-tail terms and drive traffic to the site without spending a single dime. So that's a really good example. PR, it's not something, it can be very expensive, and it's not something that works for all companies. But if you have a news cycle that you can capitalize on, that can work really well for you. At SoFi, we had a student loan refinancing product, and one of the best marketing campaigns we had was around Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about how students couldn't refinance their student loans, and there should be a government program for it. So suddenly, everybody was going to Google trying to find out about that, and we were all over that in terms of content marketing, and that drove a lot of people to our site and into our funnel. So I'm going to move forward. All right, pull-through active seekers. So I like to divide the universe of potential customers for your product or service into people that you need to pull and people that you need to push. And the people that you need to pull are the ones that are already have raised their hand in some way. They're already thinking about what you have to offer and how to find you. The truth is, when you determine your marketing budget, you can't say, I'm going to spend exactly $10,000 in most cases. Typically, when you go out and you're spending your marketing budget, you're spending a function of some unit cost. It could be cost CPM, cost per 1,000 impressions, cost per click, cost per action, cost per whatever, and some elasticity of demand. So by elasticity of demand, what I mean is like how large is the universe and how finite is it, the number of people that want what you're offering. So you can have examples where channels like Google or paid search have a really, really good customer acquisition cost, very low, but you can't triple them no matter what you do, because all the people that have already raised their hand are already coming to your product or service. So a key when you're starting your marketing program is to try to identify the sources of active seekers. Now, it doesn't have to be online either. It could be at a trade show. If you're an enterprise software company selling to a really particular customer segment, or it could be college campuses. We found that worked really well at SoFi in the beginning. So there's a number of opportunities to try to find these people where they exist. I mean, if you're selling bayonets to the military, nobody's going to be raising their hand and coming to you because the value prop just doesn't matter. And you may also run into issues where it's very expensive. In my LogMeIn days, we had backup software that we tried to launch, and it wasn't that successful. Part of the problem was everywhere where people were looking for backup software, we were competing against several $100,000 enterprise solutions that were bidding up all the keywords and taking all the inventory digitally. So it wasn't effective, but didn't hurt to try. We just weren't able to spend any money. So this is one of my favorite ones because it applies to almost any company, regardless of industry, size, sector, anything like that. Copy your competitors. When I've been in venture and I talk to startups, they always have an explanation for why their company is going to be better, faster, more nimble, more interesting experience for their end user. And that's absolutely the case. A lot of times large companies get undermined. But when you're starting out your marketing campaigns and you're really trying to figure out what to do out of the gate, you have to keep in mind that the large companies have been around longer. So there's a reason why they're doing what they're doing. They've had more horsepower. They've had opportunities to fail. They've had more dollars to throw at the problem. And so you have to have a strong hypothesis for why what you're going to do differently works better than what the competitor is doing. And I generalize this more broadly to any complementary product or service. So if you're selling toasters, then any type of kitchenware appliance, it really doesn't matter. There's a reason why competitors don't invest in certain channels, and it's good to try to figure that out. There's also a lot of tools out there to try to measure how much your competitors are spending in certain channels. SpyFu's been around for more than a decade in terms of helping measure paid search for competitors. There's a lot of published resources out there too. A really good example that we found here was at SoFi building a really strong word-of-mouth referral program. It worked really well because we were engaging in a closed customer segment where people talk to each other about student loans. They were former MBAs and JD law students. And so some of our competitors weren't succeeding with this type of marketing approach, but the customer segment that they were targeting didn't have that geographic concentration. So that was the key insight that we had to make that a really large channel. So this one, again, I'm echoing Sean Ellis from earlier, harassing your early adopters and finding out the people that really love you early on, what is it that they love about you, and also for people who wouldn't be very dissatisfied if they couldn't have your product or service going forward. Like why is it? Like, is it because you're you're not important to them, or is it because they don't know what you do? If you understand more about your early adopters, that can really help you hone the type of marketing messages that you need and the channels that you need to get out there. So I like to actually grill my early adopters and understand who are their influencers, what are their buying habits, what trade shows have they gone to, what are the last few books they've read. And the thing is, when you're a really early company, because we're talking about your first $10,000, these people are usually excited to talk to you. If they're not, there's a problem. You could do this in a survey, and I think that can work really well if you have thousands of customers. But sometimes you can learn more if you actually pick up the phone and call 2 or 3 people a week or a day. It's really hard to do more than 2 of these calls a day, because not so much because people won't want to talk to you, but because they will want to talk your ear off, and it'll take an hour of your time, and it can be really, really exhausting. But you might uncover ideas for e-influencer strategies, content marketing strategies, publications you might want to be advertising in. You may even just discover where people are physically living, which could lead to some sort of out-of-home strategy around billboards or radio or something like that. Yeah, I think that's all on that slide. So this is second nature to anybody in the growth community. You want to run as many tests as possible, but the twist here is that you want to test on the cheap. A decade ago, you could test acquisition channels. You could do anything for $500. You could say, I could call Yahoo and say, we'd like to do a big banner test for $500. And we would actually codify, if we get certain results, we promise to follow up with $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 spend. My experience in doing marketing more recently is it's harder to do that. Certain channels, like programmatic, take a lot more upfront costs to set up. And there's a lot of dumb money out there, frankly, coming from really large companies that are sort of rising the cost of all the inventory. So it's not as easy to test on the cheap as it once was. But I think that there's a couple of channels that are still tried and true that you can test cheap pretty well. Facebook and paid social in general, things around lookalike audience testing and custom audiences. You can do paid search, was already mentioned. There's a lot you can do around email marketing. And again, it doesn't have to be online. So say you wanted to test whether or not 500 pop-up shops might make sense for selling what you're doing. Start by building one pop-up shop and see if you can get the ROI to work. You can normally take a test and try to figure out how to get it down to $500 to $1,000. And in that way, if you're spending your first $10,000, you actually have 20 opportunities to succeed instead of just one. I put this point on here about incremental versus transformational tests because I think that's really important. There's a number of tests that have a really high probability of failure, but those are the tests that are going to get you to a new maximum. So you want a combination of those transformational tests with the incremental tests where you're testing the button color on your home page. You don't want all your tests to be button colors on home page because 1% times to the 10th power, it's not going to give you much growth. And so one of the things you can also think about if you have a large number of tests is a couple that are transformational and a couple that are incremental. Some channels, by the way, do not work very well at a low budget. So like, for instance, in financial services, direct mail is very popular. And it works really well if you have a high lifetime value product. But it's really hard to test that channel with less than $25,000. I mean, you need tens of thousands of pieces to get a meaningful result because the open rates are low. And yet it can still work just based on the high lifetime values. So this is actually my favorite slide because it really applies to any business, any industry, in all cases. We talk a lot about sort of acquisition, engagement, retention, and referral as being sort of these North Star metrics that growth teams focus on. But before you get to acquisition, there's a number of hurdles that your pre-customer must overcome before they become a customer. So, for example, when I was at SoFi, the 3 biggest challenges we had were people had to qualify for a student loan refinancing, they had to trust us to consummate the process, and they had to get off their ass. We call that the inertia hurdle. That's the active seekers point from earlier. And so if you find channels that naturally mitigate each of those hurdles and you start your testing with those, then you can actually get to a point where you're likely to have a lower acquisition cost. So the best channels for us, mail worked really well because we could target people who were qualified. Word-of-mouth marketing, referral marketing worked really well because of the trust hurdle, and then paid search for the active seekers. You can apply this to almost any business. One point I would mention more generically is online to offline is a huge hurdle. Sorry, offline to online. I got that backwards. So if you have an online product and you're using things like radio and out of home, you have to think about the percentage drop-off and people recalling and bringing that to your... But you can measure that and you can still make it work. I helped a company that was identifying seller agents for people, older folks trying to sell their homes. And TV ads worked really well because they were on targeted shows where people who were thinking of selling their homes were going. And that was a really cool example of an offline channel that mitigated a hurdle. Last slide, learning from failure. Companies don't do this very well either. A few people have talked about it earlier. A lot of companies don't kill tests that are obviously not working, or even worse, they retest something without a hypothesis for why it will be any different. And so I give this example from the Log Me In days where we were trying to sell remote access, and it was a popover ad, and a tremendous number of people called in and asked how they could buy the tiny computer. So needless to say, did not successfully communicate the value proposition, and we killed it. Obviously, you want to take your learnings and parameterize future tests, and that's how you can make the most of that $10,000. So I wasn't sure if that was time left till the questions or, okay. Anyways, that's my last slide, so I'd love to answer any audience questions, and thank you. All right, how do you prioritize between organic and paid activities in the beginning? Organic may be the right long term, but also less controllable and longer output time. That's a great question. So usually I have people starting with organic because the biggest concern when you're launching your marketing program for the first time is running out of cash. So if you're able to do some things to drive business and get people in the door, then hopefully you can build some momentum. If you can't do anything to get anybody interested in your product, even just like through word of mouth, like 2 degrees removed from the founders, mailing friends of friends, putting an interesting article on Hacker News and having it upvoted, or Product Hunt, or whatever it is, if you can't do that, then you're going to have a really hard time going to paid channels where you're reaching people that are even further removed from the hive, so to speak, and trying to get them on board. So usually I would say to start with organic, but understanding that it has a longer tail and it can take some time. Ooh, my favorite paid channel. That really depends on the type of business. So like I've seen direct mail work very well, but to say that that's my favorite channel would be a gross overstatement. It's very technical and boring, and there's a lot of interesting things coming out, but one of the best experiments we ran at SoFi, when we were early on and we were only in 30 schools, we actually did what I called a spring blitz. We actually went to 24 schools and we hosted happy hours and brown bag lunches and did everything to get to know all the outgoing students to really, really drive our awareness. So that type of physical presence marketing was a really cool paid lever for us. The thing that was interesting was it's one of those channels that didn't scale. Once we got to the point where we were lending over $1 billion a month, then visiting 24 schools, and you figure that's 400 students per school, you do the math, it doesn't work at that point. But that was actually a really fun channel to scale. All right, a lot more questions here. What about traditional non-digital marketing channels? I actually really like this question because there's been a huge surge in the number of companies doing ads off digital. If you look at muni buses going around town or the JC&Co furniture, street furniture, you see a lot of these ads. The thing about non-digital is it has a few advantages. One is it shows the audience that you're a legitimate company. If you're a fly-by-night company that hasn't been around very long, it's highly unlikely that you're going to be investing all that money in taking over 4th and King Caltrain. So if trust is a factor and one of those hurdles in terms of getting people to take on your product or service, then non-digital can work really well. It's also really effective if you can cluster your customers in some sort of geographic or segmentation or something. So, one of the companies I had, all of our customers were commuting in and out of major metro centers. So that meant that transit ads on those major commuter rails made a lot of sense because we were hitting just the right people at the right time. So those are some examples where some non-digital ads can work really well. Best way to get free online press coverage. There's two main ways to get online press coverage. One is you actually have to capitalize on a news cycle. So I hate to say it, but if you just launched a product, or even worse, a feature of a product, that's not that interesting. Like maybe you can get written up in TechCrunch and you can put a newswire out, but it's not gonna be interesting unless it has something to do with the greater atmosphere of what's going on. The other way is really finding influencers and e-influencers. And like some of the best marketers I know can just call up the Wall Street Journal and say, hey, like I have this really great article. Would you mind running it? It's a very different skill set than performance marketing and grinding and running 20 tests a week. But that's another way that you can do that. How are we doing on time? 5. All right. How have I misspent my marketing budget? Yeah, I've misspent my marketing budget. So the worst campaign I ever ran was a $200,000 test that completely failed. It's really interesting, actually. We were trying to sell student loan refinancing products to medical professionals. And there was a website that was sort of a social platform for medical professionals. And they had actually normally were selling biotech and pharmaceutical type ads. And I thought, oh, this is a perfect way to reach all the people that we're trying to reach. But what I didn't take into account was sort of how much if you think about the lifetime value on selling pharmaceuticals into a doctor's office, I didn't really factor that into the test. And so for the amount of exposure we got relative to the amount we put in, we had a real abysmal return. And in hindsight, it's very obvious, but it was a failed test, and we learned from it, and we didn't run that campaign again. I think I have time for one more question. One more question. Where do you spend the first 10K? All right, I think generically speaking, because I don't know who has the company that was asking this question, I would first do zero-cost channels. I would then do paid search. When I exhausted that and found that nobody was coming to my site, I do some paid social ads. And then when that didn't work, I would buy a $20,000 billboard on the 101. All right, thanks, everybody.